Are you still mired in snow there, Dan?
We got another few inches. Yeah, we've still got a couple of feet on the ground. We got another, I don't know, 5 or 6 inches this week. Hopefully that's the last big storm. I don't know. They always say that there's a storm. There's usually an April storm during the basketball tournament, but the high school basketball finals down in the cities is usually usually kind of where we measure the final one. But yeah, I've got a new vehicle that's better in the snow. I got myself a Subaru, so I kind of feel more like I'm playing by the rules of northern Minnesota.
I've been watching this YouTube couple in Utah, the mountains of Utah, and the amount of snow they've been getting. And I feel very thankful to be here in sunny Florida.
Yeah, yeah.
Did you say in Utah, Pat?
Yeah. Well, the YouTubers are in Utah, yeah.
I'm in Utah too.
Yeah. Are you in the mountains?
Sorta, kind of the central mountains.
So do you have lots of snow? Record snow this year?
We did.
It's going away?
Yeah. We didn't have records, but we had more than our, probably our average. Although the last couple of winters, it's been a little bit more mild and a little bit more snowy than kind of is typical, where we usually get early snow and then it stays on the ground all winter, but then we get the deep freeze when we don't get a lot of snow.
I think I've got more than Patrick.
You've got what?
No, I think I might have more than Patrick, but I've got nowhere near the 54 feet that's up at Tahoe.
Yeah. Yeah. They got a good snowpack. Yeah. The Californians are very happy with the snowpack that the Sierras got.
Yeah, the one I saw this week was the mountains that are behind the Hollywood site. Most people in living memory can't remember any snow on those hills. And they've got
that's
snow.
because they're too young.
They got a little bit of snow on the Hollywood Hills. Wow.
Oh yeah, even down in the valley. I was going to say we had record snow this year. It was like half an inch.
Yeah, right.
But it's probably like 3,000. Well, at the coldest it was like 2,000 feet, so you could see it on the mountains.
Mm.
Yeah. We haven't had any again this year, but we've had a couple. We've had a couple of small rainstorms and a bit of a flood. Although other people saw the flood, I didn't. So it's very. The rain here is very patchy. I mean, at one point, I was maybe 5 miles to the west of where I worked, and I got stuck in a sandstorm. So I phoned up work to say, in a few minutes, you're going to have a sandstorm coming. I went back to work the following day because it's my day off. And they said, what a sandstorm. It was so narrow. And of course, if I was in it, so I was too close to tell. And similarly, a couple of years later, I got called back to work because we had high winds and it was literally ripping some of the tent work apart, and the other side of the building, the main hotel was a long east-west, roughly aligned linear building, and on the west side, they were ripping bar canopies out of the ground, basically, and yet the normal sort of beach umbrellas with concrete stands but with the other end of the building was still up and weren't even flapping. So it's certainly oddball weather we get here for sure.
Yeah.
And it snows occasionally. And then of course they go crazy and nuts when it's a decent rainfall. And of course there's no real day-to-day experience of driving in the rain. So it's a accident alley. And then, but the local, the predominantly local Indians, Pakistanis do well, because obviously they're coming from places where rain is frequent
Mhm.
for the most part. But the sort of the Saudis, Kuwaitis, Iraqis, and locals, no real idea.
Mm.
It's one of the reasons why the army sends them all over to the UK. A bit of wet weather.
Yeah.
Anyway,
My parents had they're in Northern California, between Davis and Sacramento, and they of course have had a lot more rain than they were expecting, and in a couple of big storms there was apparently some flooding around Sacramento, and they are very happy that there's a lot of snow in the Sierras.
I'm sure they will officially call the drought off. Right?
Well, yeah, I don't know that they're ready to do that yet. I don't know, Chris. What are they saying about the drought? Oh, maybe Chris isn't hearing us.
Well,
Yeah, he's on the chat.
Newsom is lifting a lot of the restrictions for the drought.
Yeah, the
The drought.
so I think there may be a couple more people rolling in, but we're coming up on 10 past, so we should probably decide where we're going to start. So when we began this, we kind of didn't get through all of the things that or we didn't get as far as we thought, I think. So as I recall, the plan was to go to kind of continue through chapter 7. And, as I was reviewing it, 4 and 7 kind of fit together, right? The immigration issue and the border issue. The ones that really kind of that fascinated me more, not that I'm not interested in immigration and especially the Mexican American border, but the empire one really kind of jumped out at me, and
That's a strong one.
yeah, and I kind of remember having liked Daniel Immerwahr, a couple of other things that I've read of his. He's apparently related to Clara Immerwahr, the wife of Fritz Haber, who killed herself in protest in 1915 when he supervised the first gassing of the Allies at the Second Battle of Ypres. What am I hearing? Oh, Tim, you're getting background talk. So do we want to kind of talk about immigration and the border first, or just kind of take them out of order, or what things did jumped out at people? What?
I have sort of one out of book interjection, which I think would allow Chris a little bit more time to link up properly. Let's part back on zettelkasten in Obsidian versus Cars.
Okay.
I would like to throw in. There's another YouTuber called Morgan, and she's a Toronto-based drama PhD candidate. She's does the bulk of her stuff in Obsidian, but she's having trouble taking notes and creating continuous solutions for a piece of work. And part of what she's described is that as she takes notes within one source particularly, they tend to lock into a theme or an idea. And then particularly if her piece of content is, say, comparing A to B, and B was read a longer time ago, and not necessary for this particular piece, the note style changes so much that she finds it difficult to join them up.
Mm.
And it dawned on me when I was listening to this, and the link, I'll put a link to it in the chat.
Okay, thanks.
But the thing that had dawned on me, that several of us who are here now have, and although I noticed that Mark Grape said he can't make it, it's too early because he's stuck in Hawaii probably, if I remember right.
Stuck in Hawaii. Damn.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. If you need to be stuck, where would you?
He's on Maui too, I think, which is beautiful.
And several of you have sort of devolved backwards from Darwin backwards to Cardinals.
I'm sort of evolving again, but I'll talk about that later.
But part of that conversation, and part of the conversation we had before we had the author of that, the anti-zettelkasten coming, was many of us, and I put my hand up to it as well, that are sort of not so much note card makers, because we're not necessarily doing a presentation, but we do essays. So we were finding it very difficult to break the essay type desire. So, and of course, Obsidian allows you to put in a couple of thousand words with no problem.
Right.
But of course, unless you've got really minuscule writing, the card is an absolute limit. And it suddenly dawned on me that outside of the problem of I'm trying to match up two different age notes and trying also in that sense to not disbelieve Luhmann's myth of not necessarily going back to the sources too much. So having to reread the whole book or reread the whole paper is not such a bad thing, but to reread the whole book would be a bad thing.
Right.
As a mechanism, how is the card, because the card has a real true enforcement of the atomic idea, how's it going? Are you able to write essays in the same sense as you were, or more importantly, probably bigger things than essays? Because putting 10 cards into an essay that's on one source, primarily on one source, is not too difficult. I wouldn't have thought, because you could do the same with your atomic notes. But as soon as you start to say, we're taking a note about this book, for instance, we've got 10 different authors, 12 different sets of authors, rather, sort of thing. So their style is very different. We may already have read some of their work elsewhere, or we may be inclined to read something else by them in support of the argument they're making within this book, even more than just the little piece they've got. So we now end up with bits and pieces maybe spread over 4 or 5 years of reading. The note style takes a big difference there. And you've changed systems.
Yeah.
Some of you have changed systems. So you're even worse off in some respects, I suppose. So it was just really, how's it going in that context?
Yeah.
Other than I obviously I see your Substack output and I go, you're almost typing stuff up faster than I speak, really. But some of that's all very single subject, and a lot of it's just modernization of big sets of chunks of stuff that you're reading, and so that's a little bit easier. It's not brand new. It's not necessarily unique and totally yours anyway. But so that's a little bit different. So that was somewhat tongue in cheek about.
Yeah.
But you're still producing stuff. How much do you believe you've changed in the ease of production?
I think that it's for the stuff that I'm writing and also for the stuff that I'm reading, I think the question for me has to do with and I was never really, I mean, I never really kind of jumped fully onto the bandwagon of, striving for atomicity, but I did try to sort of encapsulate an idea, fully in one, in one card or in one note. If I'm, and I am kind of moving back into Obsidian too, and I'm still trying to do that there. So I mean, there are, my suspicion with the things that have been said about Luhmann and the things that he said himself have to do with him reading a bunch of very sort of focused, single topic articles, right? Scholarly articles that where somebody is making a particular point, and this is, and this is the thing, this is the takeaway, right? And it's only, and so in that case, I think I would tend to put all my notes, and that's where sometimes I would write a review of an article or a book, and and I would put all of my thoughts in there. I do think that there's a place for kind of splitting some of those things out, and I guess I'm okay with the idea of putting them on individual cards, or putting links, if I'm doing it in Obsidian, putting a link to a topic, that will kind of bring me back to that, and allow me to kind of search on that. Either I don't use tags probably as much as I should, but that, the thing that strikes me is when going to a source that's actually rich and has a lot of ideas in it, maybe not about the same topic, or things that I will read that are, that have kind of swept up a bunch of things and compared things from different disciplines and stuff. I'll take some things and I'll think, well, okay, I'm going to want to remember this, maybe in this other context that's going to connect to other things. So I think that's where it's useful to me to have them available to me in smaller bites, right?
So that's, but the way I hear that, it sounds as though I need them all roughly together for a current purpose, but I'm likely to use them in part for a later purpose.
Yeah. I mean, and so if I if I write a review of a book, even if it's a single, if it's a book about a single topic, I will probably, it probably hangs together enough as an essay in response to that book, and I can sort of, I can flow through the different things that are talked about and then move on. But I would like to be able to go in, if I'm reading a book about, I don't know, Alan Taylor's book about the Civil War of 1812, right, and how this is really, a sort of a civil war between, his idea in that one was that it's a civil war between the English people who became U.S. Americans and the English people who remain Canadians, and the interest of a lot of English Americans on the south side of the border to liberate their cousins to the north from that, from being under the thumb still of the British Empire and all of that, and how the people up north didn't see it the same way. But then there's also a side story about the Irish, right? Because the Irish are sort of in on both sides. So this is really a civil war for the Irish too, because they're fighting each other, right? And so that is, so that might be, the Irish element of it might be something that I might want to have broken out in a way that when I'm doing some work on Irish immigration, or whether I'm doing some work on Irish history or the English-Irish, the long story of England and Ireland, back in the home countries, that I might have access to this. I might be able to kind of pull this in and say, oh, and by the way, during the early decades of the 19th century, this happened as well. And this, shows,
But electronically, even if you left the essay as a whole essay, and the notes for it as a whole note. You could find that anyway. It just
Right.
doesn't fit on a card.
Right. But I would like to, I want to have, I think even in the essay, I want to make sure that that I've double bracketed something in Obsidian, right? That will lead me to, that will lead me back to that, or that will link out to, not, and I don't want to say a map of content, because I didn't have a great experience. Oh, there's Chris. How you doing? Oh, I see you, but I don't hear you now.
Oh, well.
Uh,
So, I mean, the other thing, of course, is it was St. Patrick's Day the other day.
mhm.
And I had great joy in reminding various people who went all green on me for the wrong reasons, really. Just to remind them, of course, that St. Patrick was a slave of the Irish and a Romano Welshman who was kidnapped, a bit like Julius Caesar got kidnapped by the pirates, except he was worse than Julius Caesar when he came back. He gave them the Catholic religion, as opposed to where Caesar just killed them all.
There you go.
Yeah,
That's a great revenge. It's a revenge
Absolutely.
tale.
Yeah. And in the process of that, a couple of other people piped up about the myth of the snake removal.
Yeah.
And I'd never pushed that around, partly because I don't really care anymore. And it turns out that people think that's quite a metaphor for getting rid of all the troublemakers, as opposed to the snakes, because there's no fossil evidence in Ireland that there ever was any snakes.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But I can't see snakes being an easy.
Well, maybe miraculously he removed them retroactively since the beginning of time.
Oh, including the fossils. That would be a miracle, of course. Yeah. I can actually dig up. That said, there's not that much sedimentary stuff around much of Ireland. There's quite a lot of volcanics.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not even sure that's true, but I wouldn't mind betting. There's plenty of places that are reptile friendly, one of which would be the Burren. If you know your Irish geography, the Burren's sort of centralish, but on the far west coast. And is a desert almost of limestone casts.
Huh.
You've got these 80, 90, 100-foot trees, except they're 80, 90 foot, 100 foot in the cracks of the cast. So you sort of semi-lie down and look across the top. There's nothing green. It's all grey limestone and cropped off by the sheep and the cows as soon as it puts his head above parapet, as it were. But you go to the crack, and of which they're every 2 feet, 4 feet, 6 feet, 8 feet away, depending on which piece you're standing on. There's a full biology down there, a full rainforest almost. So it's a beautiful place. Weird. I mean, fortunately, I've only been in the daytime. I would imagine that it would be quite spooky at night. But it's a nice old place. Anyway.
So did my microphone finally work?
It's working, yes.
Oh, yeah. They just all suddenly, after 20 minutes of being on, they decide they're going to work.
Oh, they warm up.
To take us back a half a step to the writing piece, I spent some time this week looking at JSTOR references to the word zettelkasten, of which there are, I don't know, maybe 500 or 600 over the last century, the vast majority of them being in German language papers since 1900. There may have been a very few at the tail end of the 1800s. I tracked down the first version in an English language piece that occurs, I think, in 1936. Is the first time someone uses zettelkasten in an English language journal article. And entertainingly, it appeared in an archaeology piece talking about the Berlin Dictionary, or what is the kind of like the an Egyptian dictionary that a bunch of scholars were building for hieroglyphics. And it's a project that started 2 years after Paul Otlet creates or imagines and starts building the Mundanium. So it's also a collaborative group, zettelkasten. But interestingly, in all the German versions that I've opened up and looked at and did selective translations of, a lot of them appear in reviews of other books where the reviewer takes the writer to task, saying the writer has tipped out their zettelkasten into the paper or book they're writing. And it's usually a negative connotation, like they didn't do enough work, they didn't recontextualize the ideas, they just flooded me with basic facts.
Right, just vomit over there. Yeah.
Tying together of the narrative. And that's probably 15-20% of the references, even in the German. And then there's a shift in the late 70s, early 80s. More of the references tend to be to some of the older zettelkasten that are like archived nachlass, or the personal papers of older researchers who are now famous, who had zettelkasten, and scholars are digging into what they left as a means of study. So that becomes a thing. But what's interesting is you can take the idea, and if you can use it whole hog and not have to do heavy editing, that's great. But sometimes you need to do a little bit of recontextualization of the context of the original and how it fits this new idea. And to pull us even more back on track until we figure out what the topic is, we're going to talk about. In America, I was doing some research into education and education history, so I started reading The Education of Henry Adams that was published, and it was published earlier, but it won I think the Nobel in 1919, the year after he died. But I found an excerpt from a book he wrote in the 1880s that uses the phrase like exception and Americans in the same phrase. And it's a fiction piece, but it's a baron from England talking about America and how America is kind of rotten and crooked. And he says, we think we're an exception philosophically or morally. And I put the thing into the vault so you can take a look at the actual quote, the full quote. And I pulled out a reasonable chunk of it. But in that section on exceptionalism, he says it's an American socialist and then Stalin who are the originators of the phrase. And the phrase American exceptionalism doesn't exist in the Henry Adams piece from the 1880s, but the idea of it does.
Right, yeah, sounds like it does.
So my presumption is that, and it'll take some digging to actually flesh it out, but the fact that it reoccurs in 1920 is likely the case that Adams's book has won this massive literary prize, and people are going back and reading him and rereading him, and he had always been generally fairly popular anyway. Somebody goes back to 1880 and rereads his fiction piece on America and democracy, and then brings that idea, almost 40 years on, into the conversation again.
Yeah.
But I never in a million years would have found. I even read it roughly the same week, or within a week of the American exceptionalism piece in Myth America,
Hmm.
as I did this. But I probably would have never put the two together, except that as I was starting to type it, Obsidian threw up a autocomplete.
Oh,
That said,
okay.
"Oh, do you mean this?"
Uh-huh.
And there it was.
That's useful.
So I've been able to, kind of take that idea of, here's a historian who places this idea in the 1920s, and I can push it back literally 40 years
Yeah.
with a similar idea with a slightly different phrasing.
Yep. Yep.
But there it is.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder, Pat, whether the local AI might enhance our ability to catch things like that and not have it just, coincidental because what Chris typed was close enough to American exceptionalism that it accidentally offered an autocomplete.
Well,
Or
I think the local AI would certainly help with dealing with our zettelkasten, linking things together if it does it well.
Mm-hmm.
And then it would be interesting to take your local AI and interact that with a universal AI.
Mm-hmm.
Be a way of testing your own ideas or the information you've captured against the greater universal thought base.
Yeah. Yeah, that might actually be a really interesting way of identifying filter bubbles, right? If you apply the AI, to understanding, not my zettelkasten necessarily, but sort of the MSNBC ecosystem or the Fox News ecosystem, right? If you can somehow put some, find something that's representative of that, or that, kind of builds that, builds that thing. Maybe that would probably have to do with, I would imagine, if you were going to do that. I've tried a couple of times, not particularly successfully, to get students to do Google searches and to see how the algorithms, kind of skew the results. But we haven't had really great results. But I assume that there would be an algorithmic kind of skewing of things, which would be kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, with Google, I often do it with somebody on Zoom, and so they're nowhere near my IP address either,
Mhm. Yeah.
and that makes quite a big difference.
Mm.
And of course, their local result of the algorithm assumes more of what they've done themselves in the last 6 months as well.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're very omnivorous in terms of where you go, you get a relatively much more flat answer. I mean, the other one that has come up, I think we've mentioned it in the past, or it's been mentioned in the past, is, and rather like with Chris a moment ago with the word zettelkasten, or the phrase zettelkasten, slipbox, notes, etc.,
Uh-huh.
was the Google result that Ian McIntyre, amongst others, has picked up on big time for flat Earth. So the flat earthers were a tiny trickle, even in Google search, until YouTube came along.
Uh-huh.
And then once YouTube came along, and they could now do lectures to anybody that was,
Right.
yeah, it just took off.
Yeah.
And and then conferences followed, and books have been written about certain people like that, etc., etc. And It's quite amazing in some respects, the forensic ability of what you can do with Google search info,
Mhm.
and it sort of harks on to the sort of like the NSA stuff, watching mobile phones. How much can you get without actually knowing the contents of the conversation? And of course, that's almost all of what came out of World War II.
Right.
You know, we could get the content some of the time, but more importantly, when was the message sent? Where was it sent from?
Right.
And one of the reasons we could break the message so often was the German rigorous application of the message would always include XYZ and Heil Hitler on the end.
Mhm.
So, I mean, all the naval ones, whenever a sub popped up, it would be, I'm sub number 26, and this is the weather report.
Right.
And so you know roughly where it was taken. You send the ship there, what's the weather like? Or you fly a plane over or whatever, depending on how far away it is. So you now know what the content was, you just don't know the translation.
Right.
You don't know it character by character, but you know the answer.
Well, and you've got a clue. Yeah, you've got a clue to
You've got
to
a
what
big
what some of the words must be. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
You've got a big they had a word for it in the Bletchley Park thing. But I can't remember what the word was now. But anyway, the it's always when people talk about the flat Earth one, it's always amazed me of how fast that went around, and it sort of harks back, I suppose, in some respects, to things like Neil deGrasse Tyson and are aliens here, or is alien abduction true, etc. And it's like, don't tell me about all the experiments, just grab something and bring it back. Give me a piece of tangible, because it doesn't really matter what you grab, it's going to be out of this world. And it will prove your case one way or the other. And it's like the other flavor of the same thing that he has is he does the genetic comparison. We're 2% further up the gene chain from chimps, and let's say these local aliens are 2% more. And Johnny comes home from kindergarten and sticks his work up on the fridge, and he's disproving Einstein quite happily or whatever, because that's what kids at their age do, etc., etc. And it's like, how could it not be obvious? It's not going to be sort of Independence Day comparatively and beaten by a hacker with an Apple laptop.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I listened to because I occasionally listen to Joe Rogan. I listened to, what was his name? Eric Weinstein was on there last week, who's he's kind of a physicist, kind of a mathematician. And of course, Rogan wanted to talk to him about aliens and stuff. And I thought one of the interesting things that Weinstein said was that his reaction to this, and Rogan was saying, well, why is the military actually talking about it and all that? And Weinstein said, remember in the Second World War when we're getting ready for D-Day, in order to throw people off the scent, they pretended they were going to invade Norway, right? And so there was this Operation Hard-Boiled, and there were a bunch of other ones, and so he named some of the other ones, I think, as well. And and he said, and so what I've always assumed is that the military saying, well, yeah, maybe there is something, is them doing Operation Hard-Boiled again. Take your eyes off of what might really be going on and look over here at this. Which is interesting, kind of also in the context of that, sort of contextualizing things. I love birds are fake. Birds are fake is my favorite thing.
It is hilarious.
Yeah,
But
I mean,
some of that goes to this thing that we're looking at is how do you take notes and decontextualize them from an original context
Mhm.
so that you can make them more broadly available.
Yeah.
And social media is an engine for that.
Yes.
So it's like, how can I take this quote? And we've even almost been trained by it because the media, and particularly in politics, there's this, until maybe the last decade, you watch the Sunday morning political talk shows and they recap the week and they have the talking heads show up
Hmm.
and you invite guests on who usually create a list of talking points. And their goal is, I'm going to stay only close to these talking points.
Right.
And the presumption for centuries has been you're smart and intelligent and you have been contextualized
Hmm.
into what the broad arguments generally are.
And that's
So-
all there is.
But because you know what the milieu is and where things are, and we're talking about it today, we can't go over the entire history for everyone. So we'll presume everyone has the same context.
Hmm.
And then we'll talk about the 5 bullet points for this week.
Right. Which
Well-
is manufacturing consent. Yeah.
Those, we've lost that context for everyone, and nobody wants to talk about history anymore
Right.
or the original context. So let's just talk about the five bullet points, or 3 or 2,
Yeah.
and then, or in some cases, let's the one, and that's the only thing I'm going to talk about and address today is
Right.
the one. If
Right.
somebody else did something else, I'm going to say, oh, I don't know what they're doing, and just ignore it. But that's the problem, is
Yeah.
they, our leaders are ignoring all the other things, and they're not able to contextualize
So-
it. And you get away with essentially lying and misinformation by
Well,
doing
and that's
that.
one of the things that jumped out at me in the beginning of that chapter on not the immigration one, but the border one, that, where he basically starts by talking about all the presidents who have, no, it's not the border one. It's the Immerwahr one about empire. Well, George Bush said we're not an empire, and Bill Clinton said we're not an empire. Everybody says we're not an empire. This week I was talking in one of my in my U.S. History 2 course, I was talking about and this is very, and I have to go so quickly in those courses. I have to just touch the surface of things, which sometimes drives me crazy. But this week it was we were coming out of the wonder years, out of the 50s and 60s into kind of the malaise of the 70s and all of that, which jumped out at me in that, and I guess it probably was the Immerwahr one as well, that in the last 75 years or whatever, the only 2 years that the US hasn't been at war were both during the Carter administration, 77 and 79. Right. And so that's kind of interesting.
You got to get rid of him. We need him to make the war.
Yeah, exactly. He broke the Eisenhower rule. But really, this idea, we look back on those years as this age of consensus, right? There was consensus history. Everything was about consensus, and it was about this idea. We look back on that now, romantically about, everybody was on the same page in America, and we didn't have these silos of division and all of this, Fox versus MSNBC, and all of that. But that was the business model of the 3 network system, right? They were seeking the center to try to maximize their Nielsen share, right? And so they were avoiding any type of controversy, and so they were manufacturing this belief that we were actually agreed on things and that there was one American point of view. So every time I hear people saying, "Oh, we need to get back to," because I had the students read Barbara Jordan's speech, her keynote at the 1976 Democratic Convention, where she's saying, we've lost this sense of what it means to be American in 1976. And then, she nominates Carter and he gets elected. And then in 1979, he does his Malaise speech, which I also had them read. There's this idea that we've lost this thing right? We've lost this spirit of America or shared social identity and stuff. And the thing that sort of strikes me because of this whole idea of manufactured consent is how much of that was artificial and how much of it was just sort of deliberately putting blinders up against all of the dissent and all of the other ideas that were out there that we just didn't want on the nightly news with the most trusted man in America, Walter Cronkite.
Yeah, well, I for other reasons that's come up, I think almost an analogous question recently. As when did the Roman Empire become an empire? As in, it was a very big military commercial.
Well, it had already conquered just about all of its territory.
Yeah, I mean, it had become a thing back at like when was the Third Punic War finished? About 140 something BC, right?
Mm-hmm.
At that point, there was nobody local that was a threat.
Mm-hmm.
Done all of the Mediterranean and a bit further, right?
Right.
And, I mean, Caesar takes it into Gaul. They've got all of Spain, what now
Right.
is Spain,
Well,
right?
they've been to
And
Britain.
then, of course, yeah, but not really, because that was, he came and went.
Well, he established London.
No, it wasn't, well,
Okay.
when they reinvaded after Octavian, then
Okay.
yes.
Okay.
But anyway, Bath is not that far out of that age either.
Right.
It came and went.
Yeah.
Anyway, and it was like a part of why I thought of it and make it analogous is along the same lines of the exit phrase from Franklin. Madam, you have a republic if you can keep it.
Right.
Right. So pre-Julius's crossing the Rubicon and pre-Julius's supposed illegal wars with the Gauls, you had a functioning republic, albeit corrupted by the first triumvirate of Cassius, Pompey, and Julius. And so you've almost got that equivalent in some respects, where you've got a couple of you've got a bigger handful of big money people, big powerful people that are on the periphery of the government,
Mm-hmm.
acting as though the rest of the Senate doesn't really exist, or
Mhm.
the rest of the congressmen and women don't particularly exist. And I go, well, okay, so was it a true empire, as in, pre-Victoria Empress of India type style,
Mm-hmm.
or was it really only a true empire once Octavian had become Augustus in like up until 26, 27 AD, and then
Right.
it went on with the rest of the, and then eventually London came along after that.
Well, personally, I would argue, Tim, that that's the fault of the British. That the British, the imperial British, writing histories of Rome, wanted to focus on the style of leadership and say, well, an empire is when you have an emperor, right? And not not an empire is when you run around the world, conquering people. Right. And taking territory and dominating people, through a combination of politics and military and economic action. So, yeah, I think that was I think that historians have done, not only British ones, I was kidding, but, historians have done us a disservice by pretending that the Roman Empire became an empire. Yeah. When Augustus, when Octavian became Augustus, because it became, it became an empire in those centuries before when it acquired all of that territory. So I think
so. Therefore, you look at it as being a country having external space that it has effectively functional control over.
Mhm.
So
Well, because-
therefore was Plantagenet England an empire?
Were they in Ireland by then?
They were touching Ireland, and obviously already got Wales.
Yeah.
More importantly, they've got the whole of the western part of France. Because
Right.
we were dukes of Normandy, Avignon, Burgundy, and Anjou, right?
Right.
And those dukedoms, part of the reason I raise it is those dukedoms were in part given by the French king, who had no fear over those dukedoms directly.
Right.
So when you look at the true map of France back then, it's like the eastern half and not much else.
Right. Yeah, and that's something that Imivar mentions in his chapter too, right? That
Yeah.
there's something involved. There's a colonialism and this question of whether people are citizens or whether they're not is a defining factor of empire.
The other thing there, of course, is the bulk of the people back then in the medieval period, they have no citizenship,
Right.
unless you're a major landowner. You know, Magna Carta is freedom for the bosses, not really freedom for the workers.
Sure.
Yeah. So there's a different approach, whereas everybody who was deemed to be a Roman citizen by occupying the city of Rome and others could vote.
Right.
Albeit corruptly, but they in Caesar's time, as in Julius's, as opposed and of course Caesar, we know him as Caesar, but it's really Gaius Julius. Caesar was his add-on for when he became dictator for life.
Right.
And that's quite late. Yeah, that's 40 something.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so after crossing the Rubicon,
Right.
after beating Pompey,
Right.
etc. So it was curious because obviously the other extreme is both the British Empire and the American one, where you're not, because of the technology, you're not continuous.
Mm-hmm.
Now, even our African colonies had interjections of bits of French and bits of Belgian and the odd bit of German. It was still a European takeover, but not necessarily the same people took over a continuous strip. And
Well,
even
and
India,
Cecil Rhodes with 1 foot in that big image of Cecil Rhodes with 1 foot in Egypt and 1 foot in South Africa and the telegraph line, and then the British did actually manage to connect those dots.
oh yeah, after we kicked the Germans out, it was easy. But even India as a country as it is now, ignoring the side issues of East and West Pakistan at the start,
Right.
there was at the point of India became Indian India, there's still the dozen or so bits and pieces that were Portuguese and French that all then rolled over later into it, Goa,
Right.
etc.
Yeah. Yep.
That all then became part of India proper, but they were 5, 10, 15 years later.
Mhm.
So there's and things like China is the other one that I get curious about, because China, as a known country, expanded and contracted quite a lot in the sort of the medieval period, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And now it's still about, with outside of Tibet, it's still basically in its own border.
Well, and that's why they were. I mean, and that land area was so valuable, right? So unlike Great Britain, which the British Isles are, are limiting.
Right.
Right? And so they limit not only the resources available, but they also limit the market, right? The reason that, the reason the Brits get so upset, or the East India Company gets so upset with the Chinese, is because they have no need for outside markets. They don't need to be connected to the world. Oh, we'll take the silver. We like silver. We'll take the world's silver, but the East India Company's running out of silver, and then that's when they hit on opium. So yeah, I think the thing that struck me as really kind of a great moment of Immerwahr's essay was the westward expansion of the United States from, the original 13 states on the Atlantic seaboard, described as settler colonialism, is not the way that kind of mainstream historians generally tend to think of that. We think that there was a break. We think that there was okay, settler colonialism was what Great Britain did on, to Virginia, and with Virginia, and with the Carolinas, and the Restoration colonies, and with New England and all that stuff. That was settler colonialism, right? We're primarily interested in bringing people over and remaking England in New England. Right? We really don't often kind of continue that and say, oh yeah, that's exactly what we did as we moved west, the U.S. And one of the things I think that really kind of puts that helps to support that way of thinking is, I'm working on this primary source thing with my students this semester. And that's kind of how I'm teaching US1, is through primary sources. And there are so many of these sources that talk about, especially in the 1740s and 50s, before the French and Indian War. They're very concerned. All of the American, the people who will later become Americans, the colonial writers, are very concerned about France using the Ohio River and the Mississippi to connect their colonies of Canada and Louisiana, right? So there's a huge challenge to the West, right? And English America is very much hemmed in, right? Even before, King George puts the proclamation and, a line on the top of the peaks of the Appalachians, right? And says, there'll be an Indian reserve beyond that. And then later in early American, in the early Republic, when they bring in Louisiana, a little bit when Jefferson buys it, but then, then like 8 years later, in 1810, 1811, when they're talking about bringing Louisiana and New Orleans in as a state or as a territory, I guess it is. And they're talking about statehood at that point, and they're talking about, and there's a tremendous amount of pushback to that for a lot of reasons. But one of the proposals that sort of brooded at that point is, well, why don't we take all the Indians that we're beginning to worry about, right? The Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, all those people west of Georgia and Alabama who clearly are going to be in the way. Why don't we offer them Louisiana, right? And say, well, we'll make this a perpetual Indian reserve, right? And then of course, clear thinking people like especially like Charles Pickering, the famous South Carolinian, says, that's not going to work. Don't you remember what happened when the proclamation line went up? You cannot stop us. You cannot stop white Americans from going west and taking that, and taking over that land. So so there's a lot of, it's really difficult for us kind of looking back on it to imagine anything else but manifest destiny, that it was bound to happen.
Well, one of the things I appreciated was that he underlined the the length of time it took for Oklahoma to become a state. Like, here's this thing right in the middle of all this westward expansion, and all these places around it have become states, but not this one.
Well, because we had promised we weren't going to do that.
You know, and nobody ever talks about the, hey, let's, you know, and we've got this horrible history of, let's take over Guam, let's take over Puerto Rico. We've had the Philippines for a long time.
Yeah.
And, you know, the average American could probably not tell you that we dominated the Philippines for as long as we did. And that, you know, that was an issue, or that was one of the bloodiest losses of American life.
Yeah.
You know, and I have almost nobody. If you polled the Congress, maybe 15 people could give you that tidbit.
Right.
I would think.
Right. Yeah.
But you know, we don't. It's like Obama can be president, but if he in retirement moves to Puerto Rico, suddenly he can't vote in a presidential election anymore. Like,
right.
How does that work?
Yeah. Well, he could probably use his PO box somewhere else to do that. I'm sure they'll look the other way for that. But yeah, well, and we promised we would not do that, right? Oklahoma was going to be a perpetual, you know, Indian reserve. And so that was, and I thought it was interesting they mentioned that, but I think he used that, the century of Oklahoma that he talks about there to sort of, I mean, that skewed the median, right? He said that, the average territory is a territory for 45 years. And I think I think that the inclusion of Oklahoma there sort of moved that normal curve a little bit. And so I think the center, the median of that would have been probably a little bit shorter than 45 years. There are a lot of territories that come on, and it's kind of weird because from the perspective of sort of imperialism, one of the things that's odd is the way these territories come on super quick when it suits our purposes, right? North and South Dakota, right? The Dakota Territory has nowhere near in 1890 come close to where it needs to be in order to move from territorial status to statehood, right? As an entire territory, much less being split into two so that they can have 4 Republican senators instead of just the 2 that they're going to get for the next election cycle. So, yeah, there's a lot of dirty dealing.
Well, I think even in Texas's annexation and becoming a state, there is a rule in there that it can be broken up into as many as 5 sub-states, which then gives it more, power in the Senate in some sense. And there are Republicans now saying, hey, maybe we should do this and we can gerrymander it in a way to take the super liberal areas like Austin and
contain them,
pack it into this tiny thing and then break the rest up.
Right.
So you've got gerrymandering at a state territory size, not just county size.
Yeah.
That I didn't know.
It doesn't, they weren't talked about together, but that idea of empire as well as the border issue in that chapter, there's an economic imperialism we impose by saying, hey, we need, China, send us all your people. Let's literally advertise and get people to come over because we need somebody to build this railroad. Or let's advertise and get people to come across and pick our crops because we don't want to do it, or we don't have enough people physically to do it while we're expanding. Mm-hmm. So let's get these people to come in, and then when we don't need them anymore, we'll create a law and then try and kick them back out or make it harder for them to live here.
That's exactly what the UK did back in mid-50s, we went out to what was left of the empire. By then we called it a Commonwealth, and said
In
we
Russia.
want some labour. And so the first people that answered that came from the Caribbean came on the boat called the Windrush, which happened to be a German old boat, but never mind. So they got called the Windrush generation. So they became the bus drivers, the nurses, elements of the doctors, but they became the labour. Now, when Theresa May was the Home Secretary, i.e. the Interior Minister, she decided to dump all that paperwork, like 60 plus years down the line, and then turned around and says, oh, by the way, you look like you don't have any paperwork. Go home. Go home.
Yeah.
So there was somebody in the newspaper last week who's finally managed to prove that they were born British, right? As in, they weren't part of the immigration that came with that. And he'd got kicked out as a felon. And because he was a felon, he was in theory, because he wasn't British, was allowed to be kicked out. And then, of course, there's this girl that ended up by joining ISIS. They've taken her citizenship away. So she's now stateless, floating around somewhere in a refugee camp. But also, the empire as was, in my lifetime, because by then we'd lost the empire as it was. When the local people, whoever decided, classic example, Idi Amin, decided to send those people that helped us operate and administer what was Uganda, mostly Indians, he kicked them out. So you speak to some of them, and they will talk about their diaspora. Some of them went back to India, and quite a few came back to the UK, because the same way as these Afghani translators and stuff that helped us in the recent war in Afghanistan or Iraq, they were promised to be kept safe.
Excuse me.
And similar with how many people from Hong Kong did we take when Hong Kong went back to China? You know?
Yeah.
All of that happens.
Excuse me.
And that all then becomes a blown up and disinformation cycle to stir up the racism again. So the Windrush generation, which was that there was a big focus on the Caribbean people, so from Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad, etc. One of the responses of that was the British British speech by, got what his name is now. It'll come to me. A Tory guy stood up in Parliament, and therefore you can't be sued for libel or criminal hate speech or anything because you're in Parliament.
Oh, really?
And gave a rivers of blood speech, where he commented about the mass change in British build-up of who people are, and the sheer size of the influx will mean that Britain changes. What he missed in that, really, was that a lot of the Indians and Pakistanis were coming who were not Hindu or Buddhist, but Muslim. And that's much more of a bigger change, because they're not Christian background, etc. And so there are areas where all of those immigrants went, because same as you had racist zoning type laws, you tend to, if you're coming over, you tend to want to be with people you understand and know. So
Right.
there's a natural congregation of people. There's a congregation of people by the fact that, oh, we've already got 25 blacks in the street. There's no problem with another one. Versus you don't really want to be the first one, etc., because you've got no culture shopping for you. For instance, you've only got British white English shops in the area, etc., etc. All those things came to the fore, and then so now, of course, what's happened is we've ended up with, for the far right, we have ghettos. But you go there, and yes, all of a sudden I've got a church that has got Arabic writing outside because it's actually been converted to a mosque.
Mhm.
And then I've also got office buildings or even shop buildings converted to mosques because they don't care in that sense, because they can rearrange the insides and
Yeah.
face Mecca anyway. It's not like the building needs to face Mecca,
Mhm.
as for instance, even like Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. It's a Roman church, or was. So it faces east. It doesn't face Mecca. And it's surrounded by newer but original mosques that are all slightly at a different angle to it. So it looks a bit odd.
Mm.
But having thought about it, I don't think the Rivers of Blood speech was actually in Parliament there. I think it was outside. And that's why he got censored.
Hmm.
A bit. Yeah, he had been or was a minister. I don't think he was a minister at the time, or had been, but he certainly had been. But he never became a minister again. Can't for the life of him the name. But how you deal with immigrants makes me laugh a bit in some respects. You've now got your second Catholic president, and you've never had a woman.
Mhm.
And so everybody else has been Christian, Protestant, Anglican in some form. Right?
Yeah.
We've had our first Catholic Prime Minister. But on top of that, we've had 3 women and a Jew. And now
Yeah,
we've
Blair,
got a
Blair
Hindu.
was the first Catholic?
No, Blair wasn't Catholic at the time. He
Oh.
converted after.
Oh, okay.
But strangely enough, Liz Truss was the first Catholic.
Oh, okay.
Everybody else has been Church of England, except obviously Benjamin Disraeli.
Right.
As in, with a name like Benjamin, it's not necessarily going to.
Who placed the crown of empire on Victoria's head?
Yeah. So
Because the Pope told him to, so they could invade.
No, Lionel de Rothschild told him to.
well, it wasn't Ron DeSantis, that's for sure.
That kind of reminds me too, and I wonder if there's a countrywide psychology about them having created so much empire themselves. But when the Romans left Britain, there was a massive power vacuum, and they started being invaded and picked off at the edges by all the peoples around them. So you have the Germanic
the
tribes,
Saxons, the Danes, the Jutes, the
folks
Angles,
coming down from the north,
Mhm.
invading. And even now, if you look at some of the linguistic maps of England, there's a line almost straight down the middle that you can still see today of where the Germanic tribes and the northern areas and islands all came down and split, and you have the Irish on one side and some of the other Celtic language. It's a Celtic language line essentially that has maintained, including those on the Welsh side. And then we don't really have a great history of it, but presumably a leader by the name of Arthur pops up and helps push the people back. And then politics kind of play out, and you have the the marriage into the Angevin Empire to kind of split it and hold the line. But eventually, a lot of the people who moved in assimilated so heavily, they became more British. And then they pushed out and took over Ireland and Wales and Cornwall and, Scotland, all the places. And then and once they figured that out, they expanded from there. So was it this, hey, we've got to protect ourselves from the continent in the north, to such an extent that we don't want this to ever happen again, so we'll expand and turn everything into our empire.
If you follow the language and you follow the actual history, Saxons basically came first, and so we became a Saxon-ruled space. That then got mixed up with the Danes, Jutes, and Angles coming. So Anglia, i.e. Norfolk and Suffolk and Essex, was where the Angles ended up. The Jutes took a lot of the southeast, and the Danes took all the northern eastern coast, basically. So that remains in the accents, and it remains in why we have in English, which you still try and butcher, some very strange syntactic mechanisms. And one of the best places for some of that, there is an English Jewish guy who lives in France and teaches English as a foreign language. And he does a YouTube channel, the name of which is escaping me at the moment. But he does a really good occasional voiceover by other people because he can't do the accents. A really good basis on history plus language joiner. And then, of course, you end up with things like Alfred the Great was a Saxon who eventually managed to push all of the rule of the Danes, the Jutes, and the Angles out twice. That amalgamation became English. And then that, with a touch of Roman, became modern English as we understand it for the likes of Chaucer, which you can just about read, in the context of you doing your semi-modernization translations of various 17 and 18th century works. If you went back a few steps, you'd have a bit more of a struggle with Chaucer, but you'd be relatively okay with Shakespeare.
Right.
And then, of course, as soon as the printing press comes along, things get standardized a lot faster.
Right. I remember when I read Chaucer in school, I think I had a dual language version of it. That had
or if you don't,
the Middle English on one side,
The other worst one, of course, is try to do Beowulf.
Yeah.
In the Old English, not even Middle English, the Old English.
Right.
But then, of course, the other thing, much of the written stuff back then that still survives was in Latin, because it's only the priesthood knew how to write in the most instances. It's a one to play with, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And then the other one, of course, that I we have to laugh at with the Brexit thing, particularly, and particularly those right wings that want, oh, we want the sovereignty back and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
Sorry. One of the things that they were all pissy about was the fact we have a European style passport.
Yeah.
Ignoring the fact that the world now has a style of passport that is almost identical, apart from the color of the cover.
Color is important.
Yeah. So the two things happened. A French company won the contract to do the passport.
Oh, how
So
ironic.
yeah, absolutely. And then the other thing that came alongside that was, let's get rid of all the French phrases, and of course in the House of Lords, until it may even still be true, but at least until recently, the actual final copy of the Act of Parliament has to be announced in Norman French.
Really?
Don't know. Yeah. So there's now they've kicked all the most of the hereditary laws out.
Right.
There's almost nobody that knows how to say it anyway. So that always struck me as funny. But somebody went through the passport and removed all the French words, like beef, magistrate, court. Because if you read things about, say, Alfred the Great, he didn't have a court to settle legal up. It was a reeve. It was a gathering of near peer, albeit there's somebody on the top of the pile, but it's a peer group of reeves would become. And the word reeve stayed around as being one of the words that we would use for people that looked after the wildlands and the marshlands, as though they are anti-poaching stroke, making sure that the common land is used correctly. So the name reeve stayed around, but became something else. And if I find it, I'll drop the YouTube channel thingy.
Okay.
If I remember correctly, Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote a really popular early history of England that a
You're breaking up.
French writer in his play, in Wace's play on the Monmouth take, he kind of rewrote the history a little bit and touched it up. And I remember a scholar did a study of the language, and for his time, Wace specifically went in and took out as much of the French and French derived words as he possibly could. And I think the number came out to like 100 or 150 French derived words into English that exist in his book. When at that time, there was a much larger predominance of French in that space. So there's that, and this would have been 1200s probably. But I think linguistically too, if I recall correctly, our modern wedding ceremony, or the one that's commonly used, we use the phrases love, honor, and obey as kind of the three linchpins, and you'll hear that in most weddings in English Christian spaces. But the reason we have the love, honor, and obey is from a time in England when ceremonies were done with a little bit of Latin, a little bit of English, and a little bit of French. And so they had words that fit into all those customs, so that regardless of who you were, you would at least understand part of the ceremony. And then over time, as it became more and more anglicized, those three words, love, honor, and obey, each come from one of those three traditions. And the linguistic difference has since been lost. But we still have and keep that as a little calcification of those three cultures from that time.
Interesting. So one of the things that struck me about all of these that I was kind of thinking about in the context, we sort of blasted by America First as well, right? And so the theme the one theme that kind of seems to pull all of these together is racism, right? So that we have this the America First thing, the whole idea, I mean, even back to the beginning of the 20th century and the idea of race suicide, right? And so even people like Teddy Roosevelt are thinking in those terms, right? That the white Anglo-Saxon, and I was thinking about actually what spurred this in my head. Tim, was you kind of talking about the different groups that kind of went to forming England. This idea that that they're I mean, it goes back. It goes to kind of the "they're coming" thing that Erica Lee's talking about in the immigration section too, right? Who's they? And I think probably Catholicism is a stand-in because typically, historically, the Catholic people who were coming were not thought of as white. They were not. They were problematic in the fact that they were possibly beholden to the Pope, but also they weren't white people. Irish weren't white. Italians weren't white. They they were. It's kind of hard to imagine, but that was the way that this whole this whole. I mean, there is some talk in these chapters. I guess it was in the immigration or the America First one about the Know Nothing Party, which is kind of an interesting moment. And I don't think it mentions in there, but of course they were called the Know Nothing Party because whenever anybody was asked about it, they would say, "I don't know anything. I don't know anything about it. I know nothing." So that's what they, it wasn't because they were thought of. They portrayed themselves as stupid, but that they sort of portrayed themselves as, I mean, they kind of created this secrecy around who was in it and who wasn't. Which is interesting, when you think that suggests a level of not necessarily that they were feeling guilty about it, but they were aware of how socially unacceptable this was.
I almost find it kind of fascinating that the new far right political movement that takes kind of that America First and racist thing, they don't use the phrase "know nothing" anymore, but at the same time it's curious that they're also very anti-science and anti-logic and I mean, they're really they've taken the "know nothing" part to the worst extreme.
Yeah. Well,
but not using it because then it would be thought of as a pejorative.
Yeah, and it's kind of problematic for historians sometimes the way these things group together, right? Because you've got a lot of racism and all of that in like the populist movement, William Jennings Bryan famously, I mean, what's the last thing he does in his public life? He defends or he prosecutes and gets crushed in the Scopes trial, right? So he sort of defends traditional religion and against this attack of science. So it's difficult because the public, but also historians kind of play into this, like to have some good guys and some bad guys, and it's hard for us when some of the people that for some reasons we want to think of as the good guys, right? William Jennings Bryan, populist, cross of gold speech, standing up for the little guy, the 1892 populist platform that includes all of these sensible things like direct election of senators, and just this whole raft of proposals that become enacted, almost all of them in the by Democrats later, and yet it's sort of like, I don't know, it's sort of like Sanger and eugenics as well. I mean, there are these weird combinations of things that that we don't want to dig too deeply into. America is a nation with a border and a culture.
Well, the problem too seems to be trying to create identities for people, to get groups of people to believe in a thing so that then they'll follow your particular political party. And generally it's done with fear of the other.
Mhm.
So it's, who are we and how can we self-define in large numbers so that we can exclude the others and say they're they're to blame for our lot in life.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
I've been reading The True Believer kind of
Mm.
off on the side, as it mixes with all these things, and trying to follow those mass movements of political and cultural thought through America historically is
Yeah.
kind of a tough thing, particularly when we focus on the bigger national news and the great man theories rather than the
Mhm.
what does Joe on the street think right now.
Yeah.
Which I think is kind of a fun way to approach some of your primary sources documents. What do the the personal diaries of people from the 17 and 1800s show us.
Mhm.
But even then, it's hard to, how do you build that up to say this? Oh, this was one person's thought, not was that person an average
Are they representative? Yeah.
or a representative? But we also went from a time when a city like Philadelphia had a dozen newspapers, and you had to compete your way out of that. So nobody. Maybe now we take a dozen newspapers again today, but we only, rather than nobody has time in their life to actually sit and read through even one newspaper, much less three or four.
Yeah.
But you can
Yeah.
do it if you just read the headlines.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, it's interesting because I think it's weird too. Try as we might. I mean, even if I'm having students read, a dozen or 16, primary sources in a week. And I think the way I'm going to do it is, they're not all going to read all the sources, but I'm going to divide them into groups that will process that. But it's still, it's a very small sample size, right? Even if they read a couple of hundred primary sources in the course of a semester, it's still just scratching the surface. So yeah, there's a lot, and there's a lot of editorializing that I'm doing, sort of behind the scenes, that's partially hidden, that has that sort of presents my interpretation, and the things that I thought were interesting, the things that I thought it was interesting to compare and contrast, right? But maybe not some other things that might also have been have been valuable. Along those lines, one of the things that I do think was missed in the border chapter was, there's a lot of talk about, I kind of like the way he kind of kept switching back from the movement of people and the economic and political consequences to this borderland as a cultural space and all of that. the one thing that I thought would have tied that together better that he didn't mention, which is, I guess I'm criticizing him for this, is maquiladoras, right? So especially after NAFTA, right, the number of factories just on the other side of the border, right, exploded. And this was something that, you know, because American manufacturers could, you know, ship stuff duty free across the border and then get the finished products sent back, it went crazy, right? So, you know, 1,500 plants opened between 1989 and 1994. I'm sorry, after 1994. In the 5 years after 1994. So, I mean, it's just, and that had a huge, you know, and that was what, you know, Ross Perot had warned about in his crazy bid for the presidency, right? When that was what the giant sucking sound was all about, right? That he was warning of, right? That, you know, that you had high wages in America and low wages, you know, 54 cents an hour was the average wage in Mexico, right? And, you know, and $12 an hour in the United States in these types of manufacturing jobs. It said, okay, they will kind of reach some type of an accommodation, a center point, right? But in the meantime, what's that like for, you know, for those American workers? So that's just another element.
I'll mention as a side note that my local burrito shop has a really large burrito with beef, chicken, and pork, and they call it the Ross Perot is the name of the burrito. And they call it that because it's full of it.
That's perfect.
So still, like, you know, it's been decades.
Yeah.
And this thing is it's on the menu next to another burrito that's a carb-based thing called the Ito burrito, because Judge Ito lives not too far away and was a big runner apparently. So.
Oh, that's great.
Those are the two named burritos on the menu.
Yeah, it's interesting. The whole I really liked in that Immervar section too, just the list of the number of American interventions. You know, because Latin America and the banana republics, and again, I'm at sort of that stage of I'm collaborating in an economic history class with a guy who teaches economics. So he's doing the macro and I'm kind of doing the history that sort of diverges from the theory. And one of the things that we've been talking about lately is, you know, how American economic power becomes, especially foreign policy, political power with people like, you know, the Dulles brothers in the Eisenhower administration, and all of that intervention that happens in, you know, Honduras and Guatemala, you know, on the behalf of the United Fruit Company, which is just, I mean, it's just Chiquita bananas, right? It's so benign, it's so cute.
Well, we started that first. We figured that how to do that with Dole pineapples in Hawaii.
Yeah.
You know, in the early 1900s.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, and the United Fruit Company goes back to the 1890s as well. You know, so they're really well established by, you know, the time, you know, by the 1950s when they're intervening in Honduras and starting that civil war and everything. So yeah, they've already in Guatemala, they've already got, you know, 50 years of they go through that whole period of dollar diplomacy, gunboat diplomacy, and then the good neighbor policy. So all a bunch of names for the same thing, right? Which I think was
Yeah,
was in the
if
chat
you're,
earlier.
if
Yeah.
you're a good neighbor, you're not an empire builder, that's for sure.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. We can't be an empire. We're a good neighbor. Yeah. We did let Lázaro Cárdenas nationalize the oil in Mexico, right, in 1938. We didn't, because Royal Dutch Shell and British Petroleum and the American oil companies wanted us to go in and do something about that. But luckily, Franklin Roosevelt wasn't that. By that time, I think business had already sort of stomped on his first New Deal, and he wasn't feeling that cooperative, which probably saved Mexico. Because Pemex's motto was, por la patria, right? So that was the whole part of that section 27 of the new Constitution, was that the stuff below the surface is the patrimony of the people, which went back actually to the Spanish imperial policy that it belonged to the crown, everything under the ground.
Yeah. If you find treasure in the UK with your metal detector, if it's below a certain value, they let you keep it. Above a certain value, you have to give it back.
Hmm.
And with the coronation coming up, of course, there's a whole load of anti-colonial talk, but also includes sending things like the Elgin marbles back to Greece.
Yeah, I saw that headline recently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a whole load of that stuff coming up, and it's like, yeah, okay. So what of course makes me giggle a bit is almost all of this conversation is happening in English.
Sure.
So now, apart from the fact that we're 6 white people chatting tonight, and our first languages, with maybe the exception of Judy, because I haven't heard her speak really, is English, or at least an attempt at English. And I'll keep, there's British English, and then there's mistakes, as in the meme with Queen Elizabeth II on it. There's a whole load of stuff that's coming through with things like, even in things like the permaculture area, which was a white Australian from Tasmania,
Right.
as in one of the whitest places in Australia, and the definitions of that is often now including either expanding or giving respect to indigenous knowledge of the land.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like virtually nothing in the original textbooks that go with permaculture make any real reference to local people, right? And then of course, coming from the UK, it's 4 countries. It's almost, I quite giggle when I see things like, particularly like the West Wing or the Kevin Spacey presidential come senator thing that was a British series before you took it over.
Right.
As in, all you Brits are the same. Well, yeah, some of us are Northern Ireland, some of us are Scottish, some of us are Welsh, and some of us live north of the Watford Gap. As in, this is a place in the middle of the where the language changes from southern to northern quite dramatically. But in the meantime, there's all these other, you get the Somerset or the East Anglian rural dialects, or even something as simple as there's a lord in the House of Lords who's relatively new, but he's known as a broadcaster, and he still does, I think, a weekly, generally 30 weeks a year, a weekly show on almost anything. But it's a chat show with Melvin Bragg and 3 or 4 other people. And there's bits on history, there's bits on culture, there's bits on art, there's bits on archaeology, bits on science, bits on religion. They're not academic type things, but everybody in the room is mainly academic plus him.
Mm.
He comes from Cumbria, so when he speaks like he was taught to speak as a kid, he's difficult to listen to, but he's to understand. But when he talks, when he's a normal broadcaster, of course, he sounds very PC, British broadcasting company, generic standard language,
BBC,
which of course, very BBC,
yeah.
right? And he's written a couple of books, including one on language and a couple of novels as well. But of course, more recently, they've started putting on people who have accents, and some of those people are also from the colonies. So there's a couple of black guys who are not from the Caribbean. I think one of them's from Nigeria, and he's got a really thick Nigerian accent, and it's lovely sound, but it's just you have to listen harder.
Yeah. Yeah,
right?
I remember hearing David Tennant say that he had to actually think hard when he became the Doctor on Doctor Who, whether he was going to use his actual Scottish accent or whether he was going to do BBC. And apparently he decided to do BBC.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting how much hangs on language and accent. I mean, the famous thing out of Pygmalion or My Fair Lady, right?
Yeah.
That he can identify, Henry Higgins can identify you to your street address by the way you speak.
Well, that certainly isn't true, particularly now with elements of smoothing a lot of the differences out because of television and radio.
Right.
But I know that I'm straightforward working class North London. I'm certainly not South London, but out of the 6 of us, I'll probably be the only one that can hear a difference. But if we got a Liverpudlian on, or a Mancunian on, or even somebody from Bristol, you would easily hear the difference. And again, the guy that I've given you the link to has done a couple on that, but there's other people who literally say the same couple of sentences over and over, but in all the different accents. And you can when you see it or when you hear it like that, you can really hear the difference. But
actually, there's something in the U.S. like that, and it kind of corresponds a little bit to the nations of North America that Chris has referred to previously. That there are people who sort of travel around, and not all of them are Native American, native to America, to the United States, not Native Americans, but American natives who do this and go around and sort of demonstrate these accents.
So the different accents amongst the various types of Sioux language and Cherokee and stuff.
Well, no, I mean in modern America that there are people who run around, on YouTube and say, this is how they talk in Boston. This is how they talk in St. Louis. This is how they talk in Charleston, South Carolina, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I oftentimes get people don't always know that I'm from New England because I learned to speak in upstate New York, which has more of a Midwestern kind of a thing. So it's more like, because in America, traditionally, BBC, our equivalent of BBC, Anchorman speak was from the Midwest. And so that became kind of the homogenizing force, I think.
Okay. Yes, as opposed to like the Boston Brahmin versus
Right.
Baltimore
Yeah.
projects versus, I mean, of course, I mean, this is where the other one that I find funny on this, if you take things like the Band of Brothers or The Wire, you've got you've got two particular, in The Wire particularly, you've got two very particular populations. The white side, but it has a bit of Eastern European in as well, and Irish, and you've got clearly the black side. Two of the lead actors in that, one black, one white, are both English. Right, so McNulty and Springer Bell are both English, and then you go something like Band of Brothers, and of course, the guy that plays the leader guy through Lieutenant, what his name, that becomes the major, that then goes on to the Korean War after. It's David Lewis, and the guy that also played the sniper that got shot in the neck and lost his vision psychosomatically at one point, got it back, and a couple of hours later, he's English, right? And yet they play Americans quite well.
Yeah. Well, and Hugh Laurie famously, nobody could believe that he was English when he was playing Dr. House. Yeah.
Oh yeah, well, there's that as well.
Yeah. I love, who I like for accents is Tom Hardy, because he could do anything. But in any case, we have run out of time, I believe.
Yeah. So you want to block out the next section of the book?
Yeah. Why don't we do? Let's see. We've got American Socialism, the Magic of the Marketplace, the New Deal. Seems like that's a natural kind of a.
Yeah, because Confederate monuments is likely to be somewhat contentious.
Well, and that would go with the Southern strategy and the white backlash, and so yeah. So what if we do those three next time?
So 8, 9, and 10.
8, 9, and 10.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is, well, and Chris is offline again. His camera and mic have gone. So so why don't we do 8, 9, and 10, and we will we'll meet again next week. And I think my spring and summer is not particularly hectic. I don't think there is anything. We're getting a new dog next Saturday.
Okay.
A Springer Spaniel, 10-week-old Springer Spaniel.
Oh.
And it's a black tipped sable, which is apparently a very pretty, it's got like red and brown and black tipped ears and things like that. The cats will love it. We also have a dog, an older dog, a 10, 11-year-old dog who is a Shepherd Great Dane mix, and she's large. So hopefully she'll tolerate it, because she's slowing down. She's in very good shape, but she's an old dog for her size. But I may, so I guess that was me just thinking out loud about the fact that next week is Puppy Day. I will stay here. I'll stay here and do this. I'll let them go get the puppy, and I'll meet it when it comes back. The new car is it's a Subaru. They call it Crosstrek. So it's a littler version of Subaru. So it's it's my size. Yeah. And I actually, when I drove down, okay, I'll tell one more, I'll waste another minute and tell you one little story about driving down. I had sort of convinced myself that I was okay with a Tesla. See you later, Tim. And I had said, oh, I'm not worried about, I don't have range anxiety, whatever. In the summertime, that was true. In the winter, not so much. So I get in the thing, I had charged it up to 100% here at home. I get in the thing and I'm heading down towards the Twin Cities, and I'm going to the supercharger north of the cities I usually go to. And I realized it was so cold last Saturday that, I'm about halfway there and I realize I'm not going to make it. So I have to stop the car, tell my wife who's driving behind me in the new car that I'm going to take a left. I'm going to go to the other supercharger that's closer. So I had to go off course. And and then on the way back, right, we're driving back, and she said, hey, I'm thirsty. Can we stop and get something? So we stopped. I got some gas at just a generic gas station on the side of the road. She got her pop, and we got back in the car, and I was just like, this is such a luxury. That I can go any place in northern Minnesota. I don't have to go to this one place north of St. Cloud or this one place north of Brainerd and supercharge. So yeah, I still like Tesla as a thing, as a brand, as a company, but I think it's a very urban solution. And all that auto driving, robo taxi kind of stuff too. We don't even have, so I'm not as much. I think Musk is interesting, and I really, I like a lot of the stuff he's doing. But robo taxis, we don't even have taxis where I live. I think we have one, and I think actually we don't have Uber. I think recently I saw a Lyft guy with a Lyft sign in his car. So maybe we have one Lyft and one taxi. So, there's not going to be a bunch of electric cars driving themselves around town, picking people up in Bemidji. I'm sure there will be in the Twin Cities and every other major city at some point in the next 10 years. But anyway. So, so I'll see you in a week then.
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks very much. Take care.